He shoved her to the floor in open court, papers flying, silence choking the room, thinking she was just another woman who didn't belong. But 3 minutes later, the truth dropped like a gavel. She was his new federal superior. And she'd come back, not for justice alone, but to expose the entire system that once buried her. Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. The air outside the Chatham County Courthouse was thick with the kind of silence that settles just before a storm. The morning sky in Savannah hung low and gray, clouds draped like a warning over the marble columns that had stood for a century. It was just past 8 o'clock when a dark blue sedan pulled to the curb and came to a smooth, quiet stop. The door opened and a woman stepped out. She didn't draw a second glance. Her name was Dr. Evelyn Grace Harper, but no one called her that in this city. In fact, no one in the courthouse remembered her at all. Not yet. She wore a navy skirt suit, not flashy, not tired, just deliberate. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back into a low bun, her posture upright, her pace steady. In her hand, she carried a leather-bound folder, the spine worn soft with age. Her heels clicked gently against the steps as she approached the entrance, confident but quiet, like someone who'd walked this path before. Because she had. 30 years ago, Evelyn had come through these same doors as a 24-year-old compliance analyst, smart, idealistic, and naive enough to believe that the truth would be enough. She had been mistaken. She'd left this building with bruises no one documented, a file no one would read, and a silence so heavy it buried her for decades. Until today. The front entrance buzzed with the usual rhythm of courthouse mornings. Bailiffs scanned IDs, legal assistants rushed in with coffee-stained folders, and a uniformed officer scrolled on his phone behind the security desk. Evelyn approached the metal detector, holding out her badge. The officer barely looked at it. "Go on through," he said. She passed without comment. No one noticed her. No one paused, and she preferred it that way. Her eyes moved over the familiar interior, same tiled floors, same flickering overhead lights, same echo in the hallway just before the stairwell. The courthouse hadn't changed much, but Evelyn had. She passed a cluster of interns waiting outside the clerk's office, young, eager, unaware. One of them dropped a folder and scrambled to pick it up, bumping into Evelyn's arm. "Sorry, ma'am," the girl muttered, flustered. "It's all right," Evelyn said, her voice calm and even. "Just watch your footing." She kept walking. No one knew that in her bag were sealed DOJ credentials, full access authority, and the power to open any room in this building. No one knew that this audit, what they believed was just a paper shuffle from the department, was about to expose decades of darkness. And no one knew that the woman walking past them had once been told she didn't belong. They would, very soon. And when they did, they wouldn't forget her again. Evelyn moved deeper into the courthouse, her steps unhurried but purposeful. She didn't need directions. Every hallway, every flickering light, every shift in temperature along the vents had been memorized long ago. Even the rhythm of the echo behind her heels felt the same. The rhythm had a way of breathing, a low, institutional hum that masked its age. But Evelyn felt every year in its bones. She passed the staircase leading to the upper courtroom wing and paused just for a moment. Her eyes settled on the heavy oak door of courtroom 3. The plaque had been replaced. The finish was newer, but the faint scrape across the lower panel, the one from a gurney someone once pushed too fast, was still there. Her breath caught, just for a second. 30 years ago, she had stood in front of that very door, a report in her hand and a tremor in her chest. She remembered the feel of the polished brass handle. She remembered the way her palms had sweated through her blouse sleeves. She remembered how her complaint had been dismissed before she even opened her mouth. That was the day she stopped believing the system wanted the truth. But she didn't stop walking. Not then, not now. She kept moving past the courtroom, her spine straight. The memory hovered, sharp as ever, but it no longer stopped her. She had spent too many years building the strength it had once shattered. At the far end of the administrative wing, she reached the reception desk. A young woman, early 20s, pressed blazer, hair slicked back into a nervous ponytail, looked up as Evelyn approached. "Yes, can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. "Press. Evelyn Harper," she said. "Department of Justice. I'm here to conduct a compliance review of internal security protocol. You should have received a memo yesterday." The woman blinked rapidly, clearly caught off guard. Her fingers danced across the keyboard. Evelyn waited, patient but silent. A moment later, the receptionist straightened in her chair. "Yes, of course. I see it here now. I didn't know someone was coming in person this early." "I prefer to arrive before anyone starts performing," Ellen replied, a faint smile touching her lips. The receptionist laughed awkwardly, then quickly printed out a visitor badge. Evelyn clipped it to her lapel with practiced hands. "You'll want the surveillance room," the woman said. "Down the hall past the elevators. Last door on the left." "Thank you." As Evelyn turned, she caught a glance from another staffer down the hall. Just a flicker of curiosity, nothing more. But already the air had shifted. Something about her presence made people sit straighter, speak more carefully. They didn't know her name, but their instincts stirred anyway. She walked calmly toward the end of the corridor. Because the truth didn't need to shout. It only needed to be heard once. The hallway grew quieter as Evelyn reached its end. The usual courthouse noise, shuffling papers, ringing phones, heels on tile, faded behind her. Only the faint hum of overhead lights and distant footsteps remained. She paused in front of a nondescript gray door labeled Security Observation. No camera, no posted guard, just a keypad and a manual lock. She knocked once out of courtesy, then opened the door. The room was small and dimly lit, walls lined with flat-screen monitors showing real-time footage from across the building, stairwells, entrances, holding cells, courtrooms. Every angle of the courthouse was under surveillance, except perhaps the angle that mattered most. A single officer sat slouched in a swivel chair, his boots propped up on the control console. He was flipping lazily through a sports magazine, a paper coffee cup balanced on the armrest. Middle-aged, heavy-set, complacent. The kind of man who thought the uniform granted immunity, not responsibility. He didn't look up. "You're not supposed to be back here without an escort," he said, not even bothering to turn the page. Evelyn closed the door behind her and stepped forward, her folder held calmly at her side. "I'm Dr. Evelyn Harper, Department of Justice. I'm here to begin an internal audit of courthouse security systems," she said. Her voice was even, composed. "Your supervisor received the notification yesterday afternoon." That made him pause. He glanced over the top of his magazine, his eyes moving from her face to the DOJ badge clipped to her blazer. A flicker of confusion crossed his features, followed quickly by forced indifference. "Yeah, right. They mentioned someone might be stopping by." He swung his legs off the console and sat up slightly, but didn't move from his chair. Evelyn gave no response. She opened her leather notebook, flipped past several filled pages, and began jotting something down with a steady hand. The officer cleared his throat. "So, you got a checklist or something?" "I do. You need me to walk you through anything, or?" said LOL. "I do, I ask." Her pen moved without pause, neat lines of handwriting forming across the page. The officer nodded, then looked away. For a few moments, the only sound in the room was the static of the security feeds and the occasional scribble of ink on paper. But the silence had changed. It was no longer casual. It was watching. Evelyn walked the perimeter of the room, inspecting the monitors with clinical precision. She took note of timestamps, angles, camera rotations. Her eyes paused on one screen, a side hallway on the second floor. and something in her expression shifted, just briefly. She didn't comment. She didn't react. The officer fidgeted. He picked up his coffee, sipped, put it down, picked it up again. He glanced at her, then quickly back at the monitors. He didn't know why, but something about her presence unsettled him. Outside, a low rumble of thunder echoed across the sky. Inside, one of the screens blinked, then flickered back to normal. Evelyn turned the page in her notebook and whispered softly, more to herself than anyone else. "Let's see what changed." Then she kept writing. Deputy Clint Riker didn't trust quiet people, not in courthouses, not in uniforms, and definitely not when they walked past him like they had nothing to prove. He stood near the hallway that overlooked the main stairwell, arms folded, posture wide, pretending to scan for loose electrical wires. But really, he was watching her. That woman. She moved through the building like she already knew it. No map, no hesitation, no clipboard tucked awkwardly under her arm like most of the outside consultants they'd seen. She wasn't asking questions. She wasn't checking names. She wasn't deferring to anyone. And she hadn't even looked at him. That's what set his nerves on edge the most. Not disrespect. Worse, indifference. Riker had been working this courthouse for over 20 years. He'd learned how to read people, judges, public defenders, janitors, jurors. He knew who walked like they were scared and who walked like they were hiding something. But this woman, she walked like someone who didn't care whether you noticed her or not. And that, to him, was dangerous. He squinted as she paused outside the stairwell, scribbling something in a small leather notebook. Her movements were calm, intentional, like everything she did had been planned days ago. Riker rubbed his jaw. Something about her face scratched at the edge of memory, but he couldn't place it. He pushed off the wall and headed toward the west break room. He needed answers. Inside, Officer Higgins was sitting at the corner table, scrolling through his phone, half a sandwich in hand. "You seen that inspector walking around?" Riker asked, grabbing a paper cup from the dispenser. Higgins nodded without looking up. "Yeah, DOJ sent her. Harper, I think her name is. Something about protocol review." "Harper?" Riker repeated, eyes narrowing. "Yep, internal affairs compliance something. Or other. Pretty standard, I think." "Standard?" Riker grunted. "Since when do standard auditors walk around like they're casing the joint?" Higgins shrugged. "She's just doing her job, man." Riker didn't respond. He poured stale coffee into the cup, the liquid sloshing against the sides, then dumped it down the sink without drinking. His thoughts turned over. That name, Harper, something about it tightened the space behind his eyes. He stormed out of the break room, boots heavy on the tile, back toward the hallway where he'd seen her. When he reached the corridor again, she was still there, still writing, still silent, still unmoved. Riker clenched his jaw. The way she stood, the way she held that notebook like it had weight beyond paper, it bothered him. She didn't look like trouble, but something told him she was. And he didn't like not knowing why. By the time Deputy Riker reached the upper hallway again, the woman had moved on. He found her standing near the emergency stairwell exit, directly under one of the side-mounted cameras. She was writing something in her notebook, head tilted slightly, as if she could hear the wiring behind the walls. He stopped a few yards away, watching. She wasn't in a hurry. That unnerved him. People like her were usually eager, awkward, always trying to prove they belonged. But she didn't ask for permission. She didn't ask for anything. That quiet, measured energy made his skin itch. He walked toward her with wide, slow steps, making sure she could hear his boots strike the tile. Still, she didn't turn. "You lost?" he asked, his voice firm, the kind of voice that let people know when they'd wandered too far. She turned slowly, met his eyes without hesitation. "No," she said. "Are you?" The words landed sharper than he expected. Not loud, Not sarcastic, just surgical. He stiffened, blinking once, thrown off by how direct and calm her answer had been. "This hallway isn't open to the public," he said, stepping closer. "I'm not the public," she replied without flinching, "and you know that." "You're walking around without proper escort," he pressed. "You're making staff uncomfortable." Her gaze didn't waver. "That's not a violation. It's an observation. If you'd like to file a complaint, I'll make sure it goes directly into the audit report." That stopped him for half a breath. Then he recovered. "You've got an attitude problem," he muttered, his voice tightening. She closed her notebook, slowly, calmly, and looked up at him. "And you have a perception problem." His jaw flexed. "You think just because you've got a badge and a notepad, you run the place?" "I don't think that," she said evenly. "I know it." He took a step forward. She didn't move, didn't blink, didn't flinch. That was the moment he realized she wasn't afraid of him. And that was a problem. This building worked on fear, on hierarchy. Everyone knew who they could push and who they couldn't. For years, Riker had been the one people avoided, the one no one questioned. And now, this woman wasn't just questioning him, she was dismantling his sense of control with every sentence. "You better watch that tone," he said quietly. She leaned just slightly toward him, her voice low, steady, clinical. "I've read your file." Riker froze. The hallway felt colder. The lights overhead flickered once, then stilled. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Because suddenly, she wasn't just a paper pusher with a badge. She was someone who knew. For the first time in years, Clint Riker didn't have a comeback. He stood frozen in the hallway, watching this woman, this Harper, with a tension in his chest he hadn't felt since his early days in uniform. Not since Internal Affairs had tried to sniff around a misconduct claim he thought he'd buried. Not since he was a rookie and the badge didn't yet make him untouchable. But this woman wasn't bluffing. He could tell. She wasn't using the line as a threat. She was stating a fact. "I've read your file," she repeated softly, like it was the most natural sentence in the world. Riker's eyes flicked down to her hands, still steady, no trembling, no shift in posture. She wasn't here to get a reaction. She was here to record one. He tried to recover. "You read half a dozen complaints? That doesn't mean anything. Every officer gets tagged with nonsense." She didn't answer. He pressed on. "Those complaints were dismissed." "Sealed," she corrected. "Some were erased, and some were ignored." Riker's fists balled unconsciously. His pulse quickened. "You don't have the clearance to dig into sealed records." "Yes, I do," she replied, eyes level. DOJ clearance level I. The judge overseeing the audit signed the release. "I suggest you read your email. It's in your inbox." Her voice wasn't smug. It was surgical, like she wasn't trying to hurt him, just to dissect him. He stepped back half a pace. "You think you can just walk in here and dig through 30 years of history like it's your sandbox?" She tilted her head just slightly. "No," she said. "I think I can walk in here and expose what the last 3 decades tried to bury." The silence in the hallway stretched between them like a tight rope. Riker shifted his stance. The hallway that once felt like his domain, his arena, now felt like a stage, and he was no longer the one holding the script. Evelyn returned her notebook to her bag and glanced once over her shoulder. "Concealed from deputy," she said, almost like a whisper. "This building has more cameras than it used to." He blinked. And just like that, she stepped around him and walked away, heels tapping lightly, not in triumph, not in defiance, just calm, unbothered certainty. Riker remained in place, his body frozen, but his mind racing. She knew. She knew things no one was supposed to know. She knew names, cases, years, and patterns. She knew what had been sealed, what had been erased, what had been quietly redacted under pressure. And She wasn't shouting about it. She was recording it. The real kind of danger wasn't loud. It was quiet and undeniable. And for the first time in his career, Clint Riker felt it pressing against his skin. He didn't know who she really was, but he knew this much. She wasn't afraid of him. And that made her the most dangerous woman he'd ever met. The door to the administrative wing swung open softly as Evelyn stepped through, her footsteps slowing as she approached the dim hallway that stretched between the records vault and the service stairwell. The marble beneath her feet hadn't changed, still faintly, uneven at the center, still slick from a long-ago resin job. The air here always ran colder, like memory had settled into the grout between each tile. She paused. No one else was in the corridor. Her eyes traced the outline of the far wall, just above the baseboard molding, stopping at the exact spot where the plaster dipped slightly, a seam most wouldn't notice unless they were looking for it. She was, and she had been for 30 years. In her mind, the hallway rewound. Gone were the gray hairs and the DJ badge. In their place was a younger version of herself, age 24, eyes wide behind thin-flame glasses, blouse tucked too tightly, a folder gripped so hard her knuckles were pale. She had been excited that day. Nervous, yes, but excited. She had discovered gaps in the security clearance logs for courthouse employees, inconsistencies between recorded entries and actual. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation, one she believed would be taken seriously. She'd printed the records, cross-referenced them herself, and walked down this hallway believing she was doing the right thing. That belief had lasted until she ran into Riker. He had been younger then, too, stronger, still wearing the smug smile of a man who thought he owned every corridor he stood in. She remembered the way his boots sounded on the floor, how they stopped when he saw her. "Well," he'd said, tilting his head, "you don't look like security." "I'm not," she'd replied, lifting her folder. "I'm with compliance. I need access to restricted logs for an audit." He laughed. Not the kind of laugh you laugh when something's funny, the kind you use to make someone feel small. "You think you can just walk down here and ask for sealed records?" "I was told they'd be available by today," she'd said, her voice still steady, still hopeful. He stepped in front of her then, cutting off her path. The smile faded. His voice dropped. "You need to go back upstairs. You don't belong down here." "I'm authorized." "No," he said, placing one hand on her shoulder. "You're dismissed." Then he shoved her, not hard enough to cause a bruise, but just enough to humiliate, enough to make her take 2 unsteady steps backward, enough to make her doubt herself. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't cried. She'd gone straight to her supervisor, filed a report, submitted the folder with everything she had found. By Monday, she was reassigned to traffic cases. And by Friday, her report had disappeared. Back in the present, Evelyn reached out and placed her palm flat against that wall. The seam in the plaster was still there, smooth from decades of repainting, but unchanged in its location. Her fingers traced the line once, then fell to her side. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The memory lived in her muscles, in her spine, in the parts of her that had learned to walk away without ever forgetting. She exhaled slowly, then turned and made her way to her temporary office, just 3 doors down. Inside, the lights were already on. A box of case files sat waiting on the desk, and a young man stood beside them, organizing them into 2 neat stacks. "Morning," he said, looking up. "I sorted the first batch by year like you asked. These are post-2005. These," he motioned to the other stack, "are the older ones, pre-digital conversion." "Thank you, Marcus," Evelyn said softly. Marcus was in his late 20s, sharp, methodical, and still just idealistic enough to think change was possible. She liked that about him. He was new to field work, but he'd listened more than he spoke, And when he did speak, he didn't waste words. "I flagged anything that had redactions or missing resolution notes," he added. "There's more than I expected." "There always is," Evelyn murmured, pulling a file from the older stack. She opened it and scanned quickly. The handwriting was uneven, the complaint vague. No dates, no follow-up, just a single sentence circled in red pen. "Officer raised voice and followed me to my car after hours." Below that, a stamp. "Internal review complete. No further action." She opened another file. This one was typed. A legal assistant had documented being told to keep quiet about irregular visitor logs. She had reported it to her supervisor. 1 month later, she'd been reassigned to night court. A pattern was already beginning to emerge. Marcus hovered nearby. "There's something else," he said after a pause. "I was scanning the personnel complaint database, and your name popped up." Evelyn's eyebrows lifted. "My current name?" Marcus said. "Your maiden name. It was under a misappelled employee code, like someone transposed 2 digits. It wasn't even showing up in the official index. I only found it because I was searching archived logs by year." "What year?" she asked, though she already knew. 1993? He handed her a printed page. It was a log summary. Complaint entered. E. Thomasuma, D.O. Don't forgive us, DJ? Complaints incident in basement hallway. Status. Entry error. No follow-up required. There was no case number, no supervisor review, just a red ink line drawn through the entry. Evelyn stared at it for a long moment. They hadn't deleted it. They'd buried it. Badly. Evelyn walked around the desk and sat down slowly, the paper still in her hand. It was faded, ink smeared from the copier, but it was real. She turned it over and scanned the back. Empty, no notes, no timestamp, just a footnote at the bottom. Clerk advised reassignment. Marcus remained standing. "Do you want me to dig deeper into that entry?" "No," she said, placing the page gently on the desk. "I'll handle it." He hesitated, then nodded. Understood. She opened her laptop and began cross-referencing complaint entries with personnel shifts. The numbers were strange. Officers who had been the subject of multiple complaints were not disciplined. Instead, they had been moved laterally. Shift changes, quiet promotions to offside positions. No disciplinary notations, just relocation. One file showed a pattern where 3 separate female clerks filed complaints over a 5-year span. Same officer, same floor, same response, no further action. All 3 women had left their roles within months. She flagged the file, adding it to a folder labeled Repeat Patterns, Priority. The next file was from 2010. A law intern wrote of being verbally cornered by a deputy marshal after asking for video footage of a disputed arrest. The intern's internship ended 2 weeks early. Another file. 2017. A civilian contractor reported being told by Officer Riker to keep her mouth shut or lose her badge access. The follow-up note said, "Issue resolved verbally. No witness statements were taken. No administrative record of the conversation." By noon, Evelyn had flagged 27 files, all with redactions, all involving the same rotating set of names, all treated like one-off incidents when viewed in isolation, but when aligned, unmistakable in their repetition. Marcus returned with a second stack of paper. Some of the sealed cases from the early 2000s got scanned under the wrong tags. "I pulled anything that mentioned officer conduct or verbal altercations." She nodded. "Also," he added carefully, "there's a pattern with Riker's report submissions. I haven't confirmed it yet, but the timestamps on his incident logs don't line up with the building's internal badge entries." Evelyn looked up. "Meaning?" "Meaning, either someone else used his credentials, or he retroactively edited his reports after the fact." She didn't reply. Instead, She opened a new document and typed a title across the top. Security Oversight Discrepancy Index. Preliminary findings. Then, slowly, deliberately, she added a name beneath it. Riker. Klent. Internal history review pending. She saved the file, leaned back in her chair. The system had tried to erase her, but it hadn't done a very good job, because it had left just enough behind for her to find. And this time, she wasn't here to be silenced. She was here to remember everything the system hoped she'd forget. He shoved her to the floor in open court, with papers flying, silence choking the room, thinking she was just another woman who didn't belong. But 3 minutes later, the truth dropped like a gavel. She was his new federal superior. And she'd come back not for justice alone, but to expose the entire system that once buried her. Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. The air outside the Chatham County Courthouse was thick with the kind of silence that settles just before a storm. The morning sky in Savannah hung low and gray, clouds draped like a warning over the marble columns that had stood for a century. It was just past 8 o'clock when a dark blue sedan pulled to the curb and came to a smooth, quiet stop. The door opened and a woman stepped out. She didn't draw a second glance. Her name was Dr. Evelyn Grace Harper, but no one called her that in this city. In fact, no one in the courthouse remembered her at all. Not yet. She wore a navy skirt suit, not flashy, not tired, just deliberate. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back into a low bun, her posture upright, her pace steady. In her hand, she carried a leather-bound folder, the spine worn soft with age. Her heels clicked gently against the steps as she approached the entrance, confident but quiet, like someone who'd walked this path before. Because she had. 30 years ago, Evelyn had come through these same doors as a 24-year-old compliance analyst, smart, idealistic, and naive enough to believe that the truth would be enough. She had been mistaken. She'd left this building with bruises no one documented, a file no one would read, and a silence so heavy it buried her for decades. Until today. The front entrance buzzed with the usual rhythm of courthouse mornings. Bailiffs scanned IDs, legal assistants rushed in with coffee-stained folders, and a uniformed officer scrolled on his phone behind the security desk. Evelyn approached the metal detector holding out her badge. The officer barely looked at it. "Go on through," he said. She passed without comment. No one noticed her. No one paused. And she preferred it that way. Her eyes move over the familiar interior. Same tiled floors. Same flickering overhead lights. Same echo in the hallway just before the stairwell. The courthouse hadn't changed much. But Evelyn had. She passed a cluster of interns waiting outside the clerk's office. Young, eager, unaware. One of them dropped a folder and scrambled to pick it up, bumping into Evelyn's arm. "Sorry, ma'am," the girl muttered, flustered. "It's all right," Evelyn said, her voice calm and even. "Just watch your footing." She kept walking. No one knew that in her bag were sealed DOJ credentials, full access authority, and the power to open any room in this building. No one knew that to the judge, what they believed was just a paper shuffle from the department was about to expose decades of darkness. And no one knew that the woman walking past them had once been told she didn't belong. They would, very soon. And when they did, they wouldn't forget her again. Evelyn moved deeper into the courthouse, her steps unhurried but purposeful. She didn't need direction. Every hallway, every flickering light, every shift in temperature along the vents had been memorized long ago. Even the rhythm of the echo behind her heels felt the same. The rhythm had a way of breathing, a low, institutional hum that masked its age. But Evelyn felt every year in its bone. She passed the staircase leading to the upper courtroom wing and paused just for a moment. Her eyes settled on the heavy oak door of courtroom 3. The plaque had been replaced. The finish was newer, but the faint scrape across the lower panel, the one from a gurney someone once pushed too fast, was still there. Her breath caught, just for a second. 30 years ago, she had stood in front of that very door, a report in her hand and a tremor in her chest. She remembered the feel of the polished brass handle. She remembered the way her palms had sweated through her blouse sleeves. She remembered how her complaint had been dismissed before she even opened her mouth. That was the day she stopped believing the system wanted the truth. But she didn't stop walking. Not then, not now. She kept moving past the courtroom, her spine straight. The memory hovered, sharp as ever, but it no longer stopped her. She had spent too many years building the strength it had once shattered. At the far end of the administrative wing, she reached the reception desk. A young woman, early 20s, pressed blazer, hair slicked back into a nervous ponytail, looked up as Evelyn approached. "Yes, can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. "I'm Dr. Evelyn Harper," she said, Department of Justice. "I'm here to conduct a compliance review of internal security protocol. You should have received a memo yesterday." The woman blinked rapidly, clearly caught off guard. Her fingers danced across the keyboard. Evelyn waited, patient but silent. A moment later, the receptionist straightened in her chair. "Yes, of course. I see it here now. I didn't know someone was coming in person this early." "I prefer to arrive before anyone starts performing," Evelyn replied, a faint smile touching her lips. The receptionist laughed awkwardly, then quickly printed out a visitor badge. Evelyn clipped it to her lapel with practiced hands. "You'll want the surveillance room," the woman said. "Down the hall past the elevators. Last door on the left." "Thank you." As Evelyn turned, she caught a glance from another staffer down the hall. Just a flicker of curiosity, nothing more. But already the air had shifted. Something about her presence made people sit straighter, speak more carefully. They didn't know her name, but their instincts stirred anyway. She walked calmly toward the end of the corridor. Because the truth didn't need to shout. It only needed to be heard once. The hallway grew quieter. As Evelyn reached its end, the usual courthouse noise, shuffling papers, ringing phones, heels on tile, faded behind her. Only the faint hum of overhead lights and distant footsteps remained. She paused in front of a nondescript gray door labeled Security Observation. No camera, no posted guard, just a keypad and a manual lock. She knocked once out of courtesy, then opened the door. The room was small and dimly lit, walls lined with flat-screen monitors showing real-time footage from across the building. Stairwells, entrances, holding cells, courtrooms. Every angle of the courthouse was under surveillance, except, perhaps, the angle that mattered most. A single officer sat slouched in a swivel chair, his boots propped up on the control console. He was flipping lazily through a sports magazine, a paper coffee cup balanced on the armrest. Middle-aged, heavy-set, complacent, the kind of man who thought the uniform granted immunity, not responsibility. He didn't look up. "You're not supposed to be back here without an escort," he said, not even bothering to turn the page. Evelyn closed the door behind her and stepped forward, her folder held calmly at her side. "I'm Dr. Evelyn Harper, Department of Justice. I'm here to begin an internal audit of courthouse security systems," she said. Her voice was even, composed. "Your supervisor received the notification yesterday afternoon." That made him pause. He glanced over the top of his magazine, his eyes moving from her face to the DOJ badge clipped to her blazer. A flicker of confusion crossed his features, followed quickly by forced indifference. "Oh, yeah, right. They mentioned someone might be stopping by." He swung his legs off the console and sat up slightly, but didn't move from his chair. Evelyn gave no response. She opened her leather notebook, flipped past several filled pages, and began jotting something down with a steady hand. The officer cleared his throat. "So, you got a checklist or something?" "I do." You need me to walk you through anything, or I do, I'll ask. Her pen moved without pause, neat lines of handwriting forming across the page. The officer nodded, then looked away. For a few moments, the only sound in the room was the quiet static of the security feeds and the occasional scribble of ink on paper. But the silence had changed. It was no longer casual, it was watchful. Evelyn walked the perimeter of the room, inspecting the monitors with clinical precision. She took note of timestamps, angles, camera rotations. Her eyes paused on one screen, a side hallway on the second floor, and something in her expression shifted, just briefly. She didn't comment. She didn't react. The officer fidgeted. He picked up his coffee, sipped, put it down, picked it up again. He glanced at her, then quickly back at the monitors. He didn't know why, but something about her presence unsettled him. Outside, a low rumble of thunder echoed across the sky. Inside, one of the screens blinked, then flickered back to normal. Evelyn turned the page in her notebook and whispered softly, more to herself than anyone else. "Let's see what changed." Then she kept writing. The room was quiet except for the hum of the monitor. Evelyn sat upright at the head of the conference table, her badge still pinned to her lapel, her fingers calmly folded. A secure video feed flickered to life on the screen in front of her. After a pause, the Attorney General's face came into view, gray-templed, direct, and focused. He wasted no time. "Adra Harper," he said, voice clipped. "As of this morning, you are the acting federal lead on the Chatham County Courthouse audit. All doors are open to you. All files are yours to access. Your security clearance is unrestricted. Do you accept?" "I do," she replied, her voice even. "You're aware of the fallout from yesterday?" "Yes." "The press doesn't have it yet, but it will come." "I'm ready." He studied her a moment longer, then nodded. "Riker's on temporary leave, pending review, but don't waste time trying to win trust. The system here protects itself." "I know," she said. "Then tear the walls down, quietly or loudly. Just make sure they fall." The screen blinked off. She closed the laptop without ceremony. Her hand moved next to a printed report. A keycard log from 2005. She began cross-referencing the names, the shifts, the timestamps. It didn't take long before the cracks started to show. Marcus stepped in carrying a tall stack of printed personnel folders. "Pulled everything tagged for security and admin 20 years worth," he said, placing them gently beside her. Evelyn opened the top folder. The first page had a complaint form dated 2013. A clerk had reported repeated intimidation from a deputy. Her supervisor had stamped it, handled internally. There were no follow-up notes, no witness reports, just a signature and a line through the page. The next folder showed altered keycard entry, someone accessing restricted zones hours after their logged shift ended. She didn't flinch. She kept reading. There were camera logs with missing entries, personnel complaints misfiled under unrelated departments, and audit forms with entire pages missing. Red ink marked cases as resolved, even when no interviews had been conducted. Another file caught her attention. It listed a familiar name. It was the third report filed against Riker, this one from 2009, by a legal intern who'd accused him of verbal harassment near the elevators. The complaint had been redacted in nearly every field. The only legible comment, "No pattern of behavior confirmed." Evelyn leaned back. That phrase again. No pattern. Even when the pattern was everywhere. The door creaked. Marcus stepped back in, this time with a small, dust-covered box. From the sub-basement archive, labeled Miscellaneous Employee Files. Might be worth a look. She opened it. Inside were backup drives, outdated, unlabeled, except for one with a faded sticker, 1997. Retained reports. Evelyn paused, then slid the drive into her laptop. She didn't expect much. What loaded onto her screen made her sit forward without a word. At the bottom of the index, a file. E. Thomas, Incident Report, 1993. She opened the file. There it was, untouched since the spring of 1993. Her original report. Typed in a crisp serif font, the margins carefully aligned, the language precise. It read, Subject, Deputy Clint Riker. Incident location, lower level access hallway. Allegation, physical intimidation, verbal hostility, obstruction of duties related to DOJ audit. She remembered writing every word. She remembered her fingers trembling slightly as she typed, but her back straight. She remembered hitting print and sliding the sheet into a beige envelope marked Confidencer. She remembered believing it would matter. And yet, there it was now, buried on an outdated drive in an unlabeled box, hidden for 3 decades. Across the middle of the report was a digital stamp in bright red letters, No further action. But that wasn't all. At the bottom of the report, beneath her signature, someone had left a comment in the notes section. Not addressed to her, not meant for her eyes. Internal language. It read, Too green, likely emotional overreaction. Monitor for future patterns. No action at this time. She stared at those words for a long moment. Too green. Too emotional. Not credible enough to protect. Just green enough to erase. Evelyn's jaw clenched. Not in anger, but in clarity. They hadn't ignored the complaint. They had actively dismissed it. They didn't need proof that she was lying. They simply decided she wasn't worth believing. And now, the file had found its way back to her. She printed it. The paper rolled out of the machine like a record being rewritten. She placed the page into a folder, carefully labeled it, Reopened Cases, 1993, and set it beside her computer. Marcus knocked lightly before entering again. Sorry to interrupt. There's someone here who asked to speak to you. She used to work here. Says her name is Thalia Knox. Evelyn's eyes lifted. Let her in. The door opened, and a woman stepped in, mid-40s, weary eyes, shoulders drawn inward. She held a slim envelope in her hands, like it might break if she gripped it too tightly. Dr. Harper, she said softly. I don't know if you remember me. I was a records clerk here in 2015. You gave a talk once to the staff about federal compliance and transparency. I was there. You spoke clearly. You said, if we ever felt unsafe, we had a right to be heard. Evelyn nodded. I remember. Talhaya hesitated, her fingers twisted around the envelope. I didn't know if I should come forward, but when I heard what happened, when I saw your name... She took a breath. He cornered me in the basement hallway, same one you wrote about. It was late, everyone else had gone home. He said things, grabbed my arm, tried to make it sound like a joke, but it wasn't. I pulled away. He let me go eventually, but I was scared. Evelyn listened in silence. I tried to file something, but the office clerk told me not to cause problems, said I might get reassigned to night shift. I didn't have support. I kept quiet. Evelyn rose from her chair, walked to a drawer behind her, and retrieved a single form, an official federal complaint sheet, with updated DOJ markings, and a QR code linked directly to a secure federal portal. She placed it on the table between them. You're not quiet now, Evelyn said, voice steady. Talia stared at it, her eyes wet. Will this actually mean something this time? Evelyn didn't blink. Yes, because I'm the one receiving it. Thalia's hands shook slightly as she picked up the pen. She signed her name in a careful, deliberate hand. The moment her signature touched the page, Evelyn gently slid it toward a growing stack of folders marked Active Testimonials 2025. For a few long seconds, neither woman spoke. Thalia stood slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for still being here." Evelyn nodded once. "This time, the paper won't vanish." Thalia walked out without another word, and the door clicked softly shut behind her. Evelyn sat back down and looked at the table in front of her. There were now 6 complaint forms signed and confirmed. Most were recent, 2012, 2017, 2020, but all carried the same weight. Most were filed by women in low-ranking roles. None had ever been escalated. All referenced intimidation. Most pointed to one name: Riker. Marcus reappeared a few minutes later, carrying another box. "Pulled these from the internal backup cache. Odd label. Unverified staff discrepancies. Figure it might mean something." She opened the lid and began sorting. Halfway through the pile, her hand froze. There was a badge log with her name on it, Harper, but the employee number didn't match her official record. The number belonged to a janitorial contractor who had worked part-time for 6 months in 1993 and never returned. She flipped to the audit trail. Her DOJ entrance was logged on March 9, 1993, time in 7:46 ASMA. But the exit field was blank. The comment box read, "Entry unverified. No follow-up necessary." They hadn't just buried her complaint. They had tried to bury her name, mislabel her presence, recode her identity in the system so no one would ever find the paperwork that proved she was there that day. But here it was, proof in black and white. She printed that file too. The sound of the machine was steady, like a drumbeat. Evelyn retrieved a fresh folder, labeled it by hand in thick black marker. Metal eyes shined on the center log. Inside, then she reached back into her bag and pulled out the 1993 incident report, the one marked "too green." She laid it next to a growing pile of reopened cases. This was no longer just an audit. This was a reconstruction, a reckoning, and the files were speaking louder than the walls ever had. The hearing chamber wasn't built for moments like this. The rows of seats had always hosted routine ethics reviews, quiet affairs, closed-door discipline, dry citations. But this morning, the room pulsed with attention. The press had arrived early. Former courthouse staff trickled in with tight shoulders and folded arms. DOJ observers sat with crossed legs and notepads ready. The air was thick, not with anticipation, but with history. Evelyn Grace Harper sat alone at the front table. Her back was straight, hands calm, eyes focused on the 3-member ethics panel before her. Behind her were 5 carefully arranged binders, color-coded and tabbed, each holding a chapter of the story no one else had dared to write. Her black DOJ badge lay flat beside them. Across the room, Clint Riker sat with his attorney. His suit was dark, polished, too crisp for a man who had never been comfortable outside a uniform. His hands fidgeted in his lap, one finger tapping against the side of his chair. Every few seconds, he glanced toward Evelyn, then quickly away. The lead panelist, an older black woman with wire mane glasses and a voice that cut clean through the room, adjusted her mic. "This proceeding will come to order. Today's session is a formal federal ethics hearing related to allegations of misconduct spanning multiple decades concerning Deputy Clint Riker and internal operations at the Chatham County Courthouse. Dr. Harper, the floor is yours." Evelyn stood slowly. For a moment, the room held its breath. "My name is Dr. Evelyn Grace Harper. I've served with the Department of Justice for over 30 years. 4 weeks ago, I was assigned to this courthouse on a federal audit. What I found was not simply negligence. It was decades of failure, systemic, deliberate, and protected." She opened the first binder. She said, "Our incident reports filed between 2003 and 2022. Each one names Deputy Riker. Each one details threats, intimidation, and physical contact. And each one, 17 in total, was dismissed." She turned a page and tapped a graph printed on the inside cover. This chart overlays complaint dates with camera footage outages and internal memo traffic. Surveillance systems went dark. Logs were changed. Some complaints were never logged at all. The room was still. Riker shifted in his seat. His attorney whispered in his ear, but he didn't move. He just stared at the graph, at the lines of failure drawn in ink. Evelyn continued, steady as stone. This next binder contained transcripts from 8 former employees. Some left quietly. Some were pushed out. All feared retaliation. And all of them were right. The screen behind her flicked on. Quote after quote appeared unanimous but damning. He waited outside the clerk's office every night. It said if I filed anything, I'd lose my job. They told me it wasn't worth making trouble. One quote simply read, "No one was coming to save us." Evelyn placed the binder down gently, then reached into a black leather folder. "And then," she said quietly, "there's the case that never made it into any of these binders, because it was buried before it ever had the chance to exist." She held up a single page, a copy of her original 1993 incident report. "I filed this when I was 24 years old, my first DOJ field audit. I was assigned to this building, and I encountered Deputy Clint Riker in a basement corridor where no cameras were supposed to be operating." The room fell into silence. "I documented the incident," she continued. "I reported the physical aggression, the verbal threat. I was told my report would be reviewed. It wasn't." She held up the page. Across the top, stamped in bold red, "No further action." Evelyn's voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. It stayed steady. That made it harder to ignore. At the bottom of the file, she added, was a handwritten note. "Too green. Emotional overreaction. Watch for patterns." She let that sentence hang in the air. I wasn't just ignored. I was disqualified. She opened the leather folder again, and from it removed a small printed photograph. The lights dimmed slightly as the screen behind her illuminated once more. A grainy black and white image appeared, dated March 9, 1993. The quality was poor, but the outlines were unmistakable. A woman kneeling on the ground in a courthouse hallway. Folders scattered, one man standing over her. Image was sent to me anonymously. No signature, no message, just truth that someone was no longer willing to bury. Gasps swept the room. The panel members leaned forward. The reporters whispered behind notepads. A few had already begun typing furiously on laptops. Evelyn didn't flinch. "This wasn't a moment of misunderstanding," she said. "It was part of a long pattern that this courthouse refused to confront. And I wasn't the only one." From the gallery, someone stood up. A young woman, maybe late 30s, her voice shaking. "He cornered me in a stairwell. I told the front office. They moved my shift, not his." Another stood. "He told me if I didn't laugh at his jokes, I'd be back filing subpoenas by next week." A man in a janitor's uniform rose from the back. He used to unplug hallway cameras, said no one needed to see what wasn't their business. One by one, voices filled the space, not with rage, but with the quiet conviction of people who had waited too long to be believed. Riker didn't move. His face was pale now, his hands still. Even his attorney had gone quiet, watching as something unraveled that couldn't be argued down. For the first time, Clint Riker was facing a room that saw him clearly and wasn't afraid to speak. The lead ethics officer leaned into her microphone, her voice measured but no longer detached. "The panel will recess for deliberation. Formal findings and recommendations will be issued within 10 business days. However, we want to make clear, we take today's testimony seriously, and we are deeply disturbed by the patterns presented." She didn't need to strike the gavel. The silence did it for her. The hearing was over, but no one in the room moved. A current had passed through them, one of exposure, one of clarity, the kind that didn't fade when the microphones turned off. Evelyn began to gather her materials. slowly, respectfully. She didn't celebrate, she didn't smile. She simply closed each binder, one by one, and stacked them back into her briefcase with quiet precision. The photo went into a labeled evidence envelope. The original complaint she had written 32 years ago, filed when she was young, unprotected, and dismissed, was now marked verified. She rose to her feet. The doors at the back of the chamber opened. Reporters flooded the hallway outside. Phones buzzed with live updates. Social media threads were already unraveling with headlines like, "Decades of Abuse Uncovered at Savannah Courthouse." But inside, Evelyn moved calmly toward the exit. As she reached the vestibule, Clint Riker was standing there alone, just outside the chamber's glass doors, separated from her by only a few feet and decades of denial. Their eyes met. He didn't speak. He didn't lift his head fully. He just stood there, as if the floor beneath him had given way, and he hadn't yet decided whether to fall or try to stand on what was left. Evelyn held his gaze for 1 second longer than comfort allowed. Not to hurt him, but so he would remember what it felt like to be seen, not as a decorated officer or a protected insider, but as a man stripped of his shadow. She walked past him without a word. The courthouse lobby was flooded with people. Some were talking, some were filming. But as Evelyn stepped outside into the daylight, the noise faded behind her. A light breeze stirred the corner of her blazer. The headlines would come. The panel would vote. But the reckoning had already begun, and not in paperwork or penalties or policy memos. It had begun in the quiet voices of the forgotten, and in the stillness of a courtroom that, for once, had listened. She didn't stop to speak to the press. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't wait. She simply walked forward, down the courthouse steps, one slow step at a time. And behind her, for the first time in 30 years, the doors of the Chatham County Courthouse stood open, not to silence, but to truth. The knock at the door wasn't loud. It was hesitant, like someone unsure if they had the right to be there. Evelyn looked up from her desk. It was well after 6 p.m. The courthouse had emptied. Marcus had gone home hours earlier. She didn't expect visitors, but the knock came again. She rose and opened it slowly. There, standing in the hallway under flickering fluorescent lights, was Clint Riker. His uniform was gone. He wore a wrinkled button-down shirt, sleeves rolled halfway, the collar askew. His eyes were sunken, his face pale. He looked smaller than he had in the courtroom. Not physically, but in posture, in presence. He looked like someone who had nothing left to stand on. "May I come in?" he asked. Evelyn didn't speak. She stepped aside. He entered without looking around, like the space might reject him at any moment. She sat behind her desk again. He remained standing. "I remember," he said. She didn't move. "I remember that day. The hallway. You were, what, 24? You had a clipboard. You walked like you had a right to be there. That bothered me. I didn't understand why someone so young, so calm, could walk through this place like it belonged to her." And he trailed off, searching for words he hadn't said aloud before. "I told myself you were exaggerating, that it was nothing, that I hadn't really pushed you, that you were being dramatic. But I knew. I've always known." Evelyn folded her hands. "I watched your testimony," he added, "every second. I wanted to leave halfway through, but I didn't. I sat in it. I think that's the first time I've ever actually done that." She said nothing. Riker swallowed, his voice tightening. "I've done things." "That's what you came to say?" Evelyn asked softly. He hesitated. "No," he said. "I came to ask, what happens now?" She looked at him, long and hard. "Now? You right." His brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "You right," she repeated. "Everything. Not just what you did, but what you didn't stop. Every time you stood by. Every time you let someone else get hurt because you thought silence was neutral, it's not. Silence is a choice, a loud one. Riker's shoulders sagged. He sat down slowly in the chair across from her, staring at the carpet. "I was never told no," he whispered. "Not once." Evelyn's gaze didn't soften. "Then let this be the first time." Riker sat there hunched over, his hands clasped between his knees, like a boy waiting for punishment. But Evelyn wasn't interested in punishment, not in the old way. She wasn't here to humiliate or to gloat. That wasn't the work. She opened a drawer and took out a yellow legal pad, then placed a pen beside it. "This isn't for me," she said. "This is for the record, for the people who deserve to know the truth." He looked at the pad like it was heavier than a weapon. "You'll write a statement," she continued. "Detailed, honest. You'll name names, dates, incidents, cover-ups. Not to plead for leniency, not to clear your conscience, but to document the truth that was denied for decades." He looked up at her. "What happens to it?" She answered without hesitation. "It goes into the federal record, into the public misconduct database, and it goes to every person whose file was dismissed because someone like you said their story wasn't worth believing." A quiet fell between them. Finally, he nodded. "I thought, if I admitted it, I'd lose everything. My job, my name, my legacy." "You already lost those," she replied. He looked away. "What you can give back," she added, "is a full account of the harm you helped bury. Some people don't get that chance. Don't waste yours." He picked up the pen, staring at it for a long moment. "I don't know how to start," he said. Evelyn didn't flinch. "Start with the hallway, 1993. You remember that clearly, don't you?" He nodded. "Then start there." He lowered the pen to paper and began to write. Evelyn returned to her desk and opened a fresh document on her computer. She titled it, "Recommendation for Permanent Decertification, Officer C. Riker." As Riker scribbled behind her, she typed steadily. Her words were direct, free of emotion, and precise. She outlined a recommendation not only for permanent decertification, but for Riker's inclusion in a national public-facing registry of law enforcement misconduct. She added that his written confession would be preserved as evidence, not for leniency, but as proof of acknowledgement, a precedent that silence is no longer the default. She called for a mandatory testimony requirement should criminal or civil suits arise in the future, citing Riker as both witness and participant in a culture of normalized abuse. There would be no sealed records, no protected anonymity, no quiet retirements. Only daylight. Riker's pen scratched across the page, faster now, as though something in him had broken loose, a dam that had finally cracked under the pressure of truth too long ignored. But Evelyn didn't look up. She kept typing. Because this part wasn't about him. This was about the institution that had protected him, and the many it had crushed along the way. By the time Riker finished writing, the room had grown darker. The sun had dipped low behind the courthouse towers, casting long bars of orange light across the floor. He placed the pen down gently, almost with reverence, as if the act of writing had taken more from him than any consequence ever had. He looked up at Evelyn, but she was still typing, her face illuminated only by the screen. There was no triumph in her expression, no sense of victory, just focus, determination, resolve born of endurance. He cleared his throat softly. "I added one thing," he said. "It's about a clerk I threatened. I never laid a hand on her, but the fear I used, that was the weapon. I think that matters too." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "It does." He nodded. "Do I leave it with you?" he asked, gesturing to the pages. "No," she said. "You'll take it down to the ethics panel office yourself. You'll deliver it in person, with your ID. You'll sign the record under oath." He hesitated. "I'll do it," he said finally. She leaned back, hands folding in front of her. "And when they ask why you're doing this, what will you say?" He exhaled slowly, voice quiet. "Because no one ever told me no, and because someone finally did." She gave a single nod, then turned back to her screen. He stood, but lingered by the door. "You probably don't want to hear it, but I am sorry." Evelyn didn't look at him. "I believe you're sorry." There was a pause. "I just don't think that's enough." He lowered his head, opened the door, and walked out. The silence he left behind wasn't empty. It was full, heavy, not with regret, but with the echo of change beginning to move. Marcus returned a few minutes later, his coat slung over his shoulder, surprised to find her still in the office. "You're still here?" he asked. "Everything okay?" Evelyn closed her laptop. Riker came by. Marcus stiffened. "Here?" She nodded. He confessed, wrote everything, brought it out into the light. Marcus looked stunned. I didn't think he had it in him." Evelyn didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for the new folder she had created and tucked it carefully into her secure case. Marcus tilted his head. "So what happens now?" Evelyn stood and walked toward the door, pausing in the hallway, where the lights had just turned on for the night. "It's not about him anymore," she said softly. "It's about the silence that made him possible." And with that, she stepped into the corridor, one hand on her briefcase, the other brushing lightly along the wall she once fell against, now reclaimed by truth. The official memo from the Department of Justice arrived just after dawn. It was crisp, formal, and unflinchingly clear. The Attorney General's signature sat beneath the final paragraph, authorizing the implementation of Evelyn Harper's full set of recommendations. The first item: the creation of a national law enforcement misconduct registry, a publicly accessible database documenting substantiated complaints, settlements, and confirmed cases of abuse or dereliction. The second, the expansion of whistleblower protections for civilian employees, interns, aides, janitors, clerks, and any non-discriminating personnel within the federal and state court system. The third, a policy mandate requiring all ethics complaints older than 10 years to be reviewed by a third-party oversight board, beginning with archive reports from Chatham County Courthouse. It wasn't just a win. It was a tectonic shift. And Evelyn sat in her temporary office, reading the memo once, then twice, as sunlight spilled across her desk. Marcus burst in a few minutes later, waving his phone. "It's official," he said, breathless. "They approved everything. Everything you asked for. It's all over the news. You did it." She smiled, but only faintly. "It's not about me." He blinked. "But you?" "It's about the record," she said. "It's about who comes after us. They won't have to start at zero. That's what matters." Marcus sat, still stunned. "They want you to stay, you know? They want you to lead the task force, nationwide." Evelyn nodded slowly. "I know." Outside, the courthouse courtyard filled with press vans, community leaders, and survivors. A long table had been set near the grand staircase for what the DOJ called a restorative announcement, but Evelyn understood it better. It was a reckoning wrapped in hope. She stood from her desk and smoothed the front of her blazer. Then she picked up her original 1993 report, now stamped reopened and verified, and slid it into her leather briefcase. One last time, she walked toward the light. The courthouse steps had never been this full. Elected officials stood beside janitors, former clerks beside federal agents, reporters lined the edges with microphones, extended like offerings. And just behind the velvet rope stood people who had never expected to be heard. Women who had once whispered their stories to each other in break rooms. Men who had silently carried the weight of knowing and saying nothing. At the podium, Evelyn Harper stepped into view. She carried no script, She didn't need one. The DOJ seal was displayed behind her, but she made no reference to power. Instead, she began with a name. Talia Raymond, she said, court clerk, employed from 2012 to 2016. Filed a report of physical harassment in 2015. It was dismissed without review. She paused. Today her complaint is reinstated. Today her voice is entered into the federal record. A beat of silence. Then another name. Michael Jensen, night janitor. Watched footage disappear from evidence logs in 2018. Spoke to his supervisor. Was told it was above his pay grade. She looked up, her voice low but firm. It's not above anyone's pay grade to be decent, to speak, to act. She glanced at the crowd, scanning faces she didn't know but somehow recognized in spirit. For too long, silence wore a badge. For too long, complicity was dressed in decorum. What happened in this building, and in others like it, wasn't just about power. It was about the spaces we created to protect it. There was no applause. Only the sound of people breathing deeply, many holding it in, some swallowing tears. I came here 30 years ago and was told I was too green, too emotional, too new. But the truth is this building was too old, too silent, too afraid of its own reflection. She lifted the page in her hand, the same one she'd once written in pain, now lifted in purpose. I don't bring this to shame, I bring it to light, because shame thrives in darkness. Accountability needs daylight. She looked out again, scanning the faces, her voice softening. This isn't about one man, it never was. It's about all the rooms we let rot in silence. It's about every joke unchecked, every file deleted, every bruise ignored, and it's about what we choose now. She took a breath, the kind that steadies not just the lungs, but the soul. We begin again, not with perfection, but with truth, Celeste said. A hush followed her final word, and for a moment, the silence was sacred. Then a single clap broke through. Soft, hesitant. Another followed. Then another. And soon the steps of the courthouse filled with slow, reverent applause. Not thunderous, not wild, but deliberate. Earnest, the kind of applause meant not for performance, but for transformation. When the applause faded, Evelyn stepped down from the podium with a calmness that didn't ask for attention. People reached out as she passed, some for handshakes, some just to touch her sleeve. She acknowledged them all with a nod, a quiet thank you, a steady look that said more than any speech could. She walked the same halls she had walked decades ago, but they felt different now. Not because they had changed, but because she had. The tiles still creaked in the same places. The elevator still hummed with age. Courtroom 3B still bore the faint water stain in the upper left ceiling tile that no one ever bothered to fix, but none of it owned her anymore. The weight was gone. She paused by the basement hallway, the same one where it had all begun. She let her fingers graze the cold stone wall, the one she was pushed against so long ago. But this time, there was no flash of pain, no rush of shame, just memory, just proof that she had survived it. And then rewritten it. She made her way back to her office. Marcus was inside, boxing up files, still buzzing from the press conference. That was incredible, he said. You saw them, right? Some of those people, reporters, clerks, even one of the circuit judges, they were crying. You said things nobody ever dared to say out loud in a courthouse like this. Evelyn smiled faintly and began sorting through her own papers. He stopped. You're not really leaving, are you? She looked at him. I have to. He shook his head. But why? This is your building now. Your reform. They'd follow you anywhere. She looked down at her DOJ badge, resting on the desk like it was waiting for one final gesture. They shouldn't follow me, she said. They should follow the work, not the woman. Marcus didn't reply, because he knew she was right. Evelyn took one last look around the room, the file cabinets, the worn rug. The calendar still turned to the month she'd arrived. It wasn't much, but it had become the center of something bigger, and that center had done its job. She opened a drawer and slid the badge inside. Then she wrote a small note on a yellow sticky pad and placed it on top. It read, "Let the silence end here." She closed the drawer softly. Marcus walked her out. No cameras, no ceremony, just the rhythm of footsteps against linoleum and the low hum of institutional quiet that now felt, finally, honest. At the front of the building she stopped, looked up at the emblem over the door, the same emblem that had once stood like a wall between her and justice. Now, it was just a symbol. It didn't own her either. Marcus reached for the door. She touched his arm. "You'll keep going?" He nodded. "Always." She smiled. And then, with quiet grace, Evelyn Grace Harper stepped out of the courthouse for the last time. No spotlight. No applause. Only the afternoon sun and the sound of a door closing behind her, gentle, but finally. The citation arrived in a plain white envelope. No ceremony, no entourage, just a simple seal from the Department of Justice, and a line of type on official letterhead that read, "In recognition of Dr. Evelyn Grace Harper for restoring the record." Evelyn opened it at her kitchen table. No one else was home. The letter was crisp, the ink dark. She read it once, smiled, and folded it back into the envelope. She didn't frame it. She didn't post about it. She placed it in a drawer next to her grandfather's Bible and a photo of her mother in nursing whites. That was enough. Later that week, she packed a small duffel bag and boarded a train bound south. Not for business, not for press, but for peace. She arrived in Birmingham as the sun fell low across the rooftops, painting the streets gold. The sidewalks hadn't changed much. The corner store still sold sweet tea in mason jars, children still chased basketballs into driveways, and her childhood home still stood on the corner of 8th and Crestline, just like it had in the summers when she ran barefoot down the block with her sister. Evelyn walked up the cracked front steps without knocking. She had given her aunt a key years ago, but never expected her to use it. Still, the door was unlocked, as it always had been. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon oil and thyme. She paused in the doorway, her fingers brushing the wooden frame, remembering the way her mother used to stand in the kitchen window, humming old gospel songs while washing dishes. The hallway was lined with photos, school portraits, church groups, graduation caps tilted with pride. She walked slowly through the house, touching each frame lightly. These were her roots, her reminders. Not of struggle, but of strength passed down in quiet ways. In her childhood bedroom, the wallpaper still bore faint stars and moons. She sat on the edge of the old twin bed and exhaled. She didn't cry. She just listened to the silence, the kind that heals, not haunts. The next chapter of Evelyn Harper's life didn't involve podiums or press briefings. It unfolded quietly in community centers, church basements, and city council chambers tucked into forgotten corners of America. She took a consulting job with a modest civic nonprofit, helping small towns and mid-sized cities build their first real oversized systems. Places that had no internal affairs division, places where complaints went straight into drawers or straight into the trash. She taught them how to preserve records, how to build with transparency from the foundation, not as a patchwork afterthought. She never charged a speaking fee. She never brought a film crew. And when national media outlets came calling, networks offering exclusive interviews, publishers dangling six-figure book deals, she declined every single one. Her answer was always the same. The story was never about me. It was about the silence, the record. The people whose names were erased, let them speak. Even so, her story traveled. Not as legend, but as blueprint. The video of her courthouse press conference became a staple in ethics training for newly appointed state judges. Her phrase, "Let the silence end here," was carved into the walls of a new judicial training academy in Baltimore. Students wore it on wristbands. Activists stitched it onto banners. In city after city, grassroots coalitions used her due general accountability systems. Letters poured in. Emails, DMs, handwritten notes left taped to her nonprofit's front door. Some were long, filled with testimony and grief. Some were short and raw. One simply read, "You made me feel seen. You made me speak." Marcus forwarded her one that came from a young black woman in Minneapolis. She had just completed her degree in criminal justice. She had watched Evelyn's story on a bus ride home after her first job interview. "I didn't know people like us could walk into places like that and change them," she wrote. "Now I want to." It was messages like these that meant more than medals. They told her the work hadn't just been institutional. It had been generational. It had reached into places the DOJ could never touch, into living rooms, lecture halls, kitchens, and classrooms. It had cracked open something deeper than policy, the belief that power could be confronted not just by anger, but by record-keeping, by clarity, by remembering. Evelyn didn't respond to every message. She couldn't, but she read them all, every word. Late one afternoon, she visited a small charter school in Montgomery, where her niece was teaching high school civics. It was the kind of school built on grit and community donations. The chairs were mismatched, the projector was temperamental, but the room pulsed with energy. That day, her niece played the recording of Evelyn's speech during a unit on civic duty. The students listened, hushed and wide-eyed. And when the screen went black, the teacher asked softly, "What did you take from that?" There was silence. Then, from the back of the room, a girl no older than 16 whispered, "I want to be her." Evelyn heard the words from the hallway. She didn't walk in. She just closed her eyes and smiled. Years passed, and Evelyn Harper's name settled into public memory, not as a firebrand, not as a celebrity, but as a steady presence, a reference point. Her name began to appear not in headlines, but in footnotes by Diet in legal journals, ethics manuals, and academic research. She was the example used when professors asked, "What does real reform look like?" Her silence, once forced by fear, had transformed into deliberate power. She chose when to speak, and when she did, her voice moved policy. In Atlanta, a civilian oversight board credited her model with helping them expose a payroll fraud scheme inside their sheriff's department. In Detroit, her casework became the cornerstone of a new internal review framework designed by survivors of courthouse abuse. In Fresno, a college senior defended her thesis on restorative justice, titling it The Harper Doctrine. But Evelyn never sought attention for any of this. Her days were simple, walking trails, reading case files, taking phone calls from places she'd never visited but felt spiritually tied. Her consulting work continued, but always under the radar. She declined panels, ribbon cuttings, and awards dinners. She said no so often that people learned to stop asking and instead simply built in her name. She kept the original copy of her DOJ citation tucked in a folder behind her kitchen spice rack, next to letters from her sister and an old church program. Sometimes she would sit with her neighbors on the porch, watching the sun set behind the low Alabama hills. They'd talk about everything but her past. She liked it that way. But occasionally someone would ask, softly, respectfully, "How do you get through it?" Evelyn always gave the same answer. "I stopped asking who hurt me. I started asking who kept the door closed. Then I kicked it open." There was power in that sentence, not because it roared, but because it spoke of years, of silence broken, of the difference between punishment and prevention. One spring morning, she received a manila envelope from a district office in Sacramento. Inside was a copy of a newly passed bill an ordinance requiring all courthouse security personnel in the county to undergo trauma-informed de-escalation training and periodic evaluations. The first sentence read, "This policy is modeled in part on the work of Dr. Evelyn Harper." No signature, no request for feedback, just an acknowledgement. She stared at the paper for a long time. Then she folded it, placed it inside her file drawer, and returned to the casework she had been reviewing. Two young whistleblowers from Kansas, trying to prove a pattern of access log tampering. She picked up the phone, dialed the number, and when the nervous voice answered on the other end, she said, "You're not alone. I've seen this before. Let's get to work." And just like that, the cycle of truth-telling continued. Not as a movement of one, but as a widening ripple, stretching from courtroom floors to high school classrooms to quiet porches across the country. She never wanted a legacy. But Evelyn Grace Harper had become one. Simply by refusing to stay silent and making sure the next voices didn't have to rise alone. The login screen glowed against the early morning quiet of Evelyn Harper's small office. The DOJ system hadn't changed much over the years. Still plain, still utilitarian, but the moment felt anything but ordinary. She leaned forward slowly, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then she typed in her credentials. One final time. The system accepted her clearance instantly, displaying a blinking green light at the top of the page. Authorized Access Oversight Records Portal. From a folder beside her desk, she pulled out a delicate manila envelope. Right side was the original handwritten complaint from 1993, the one she had filed as a 24-year-old compliance analyst. Fresh-eyed and determined. The paper was fragile now, edges curling from time and air. The ink had faded slightly, but her words were still visible, still sharp. Each line had been written through clenched, conteethed, and trembling hands, and now, 30 years later, it was going to be seen. Evelyn placed the document on the scanner. The machine hummed softly, slowly rendering the pages into digital permanence. When the scan finished, she clicked Upload. The interface prompted a final question. Classify record? She selected Active Record, Verified Misconduct, Level I. The screen asked if she wanted to redact any information. She didn't hesitate. No. Submit in full. With a final keystroke, her original report, the one that had vanished into silence, was now part of the Federal Archive. Not as a footnote, not as an allegation, but as history. She sat back and exhaled. Her eyes drifted to the clock. 6:08 a.m. The sun hadn't quite risen yet, but the glow outside her window was beginning to soften. At that same moment, across the country, the National Misconduct Registry went live. Thousands of names, thousands of dates, confirmed reports, final outcomes, internal investigations, third-party reviews, dismissals, resignations, terminations, no redactions, no cover pages, no sealed judgments. A full, searchable archive of law enforcement and courthouse misconduct, accessible to anyone, from any device, at any time. A digital monument to every voice once buried. The moment the registry went live, the ripple effect began. It wasn't loud. There were no sirens, no headlines breaking across national news. It started in smaller, quieter spaces. Community centers, law school lounges, courthouse break rooms. People who had waited years to know, years to confirm what they had suspected, now had access. A young intern in Ohio sat at her desk in a public defender's office. She was barely 21, still learning the ropes. She opened the registry half out of curiosity, half out of habit, entering the name of an officer she'd only ever referred to in hushed tones. He had cornered her once, pressed too close in a storage room after a hearing, his badge shining like a dare. She held her breath as the search ran. The screen flashed with a result. Officer Bradley M. Shaw, sustained complaint, 2020, inappropriate conduct, no disciplinary follow. She stared at it for a long moment. Her lips didn't move, but her hands, once trembling when she passed him in the halls, were now still. She whispered to herself, "I knew it." She wasn't alone. Across the country, courthouse clerks searched names of supervisors who had laughed too loud at someone else's pain. Legal interns looked up judges who dismissed them with a wink and a stare. Junior officers typed in the names of sergeants they were told to never question. And in every corner of that digital archive, there were echoes of accountability finally arriving, quiet but seismic. A librarian in Baltimore printed Evelyn's 1993 report and pinned it on a display board labeled "Voices Restored." A professor in Chicago created an entire curriculum around the ethics of sealed files and institutional memory, using Evelyn's case as the foundation. And in one small town in Kansas, a group of high school seniors pulled up the registry as part of their senior capstone. One of them, Maria, with tightly braided hair and an old soul in her eyes, found the name of a former sheriff who had harassed her older cousin into quitting a courthouse janitorial job. His record showed 3 sustained complaints, none of them acted on. Maria took a photo of the screen and sent it to her cousin with a single text. Reply came seconds later. "Thank God someone finally saw us." In her office, Evelyn watched the site's analytics tick upward. She didn't smile, but her chest rose a little. She turned from her laptop and walked over to the large corkboard along the wall. What had once been her investigation board, for months it had been filled with pinned photos, notes, redacted reports, and printed emails. Now it was almost bare. Only one photo remained, a grainy still of Clint Riker from courthouse security footage, dated months ago. She studied it for a moment, not with anger, but with clarity. Then she reached up, unpinned the photo, folded it cleanly, and placed it in a small box, already holding her badge, her DOJ citation, and the scanned printout of her original complaint. She closed the lid and sat back, not with a sense of ending, but with a sense of arrival. Evelyn stood in the middle of her office, surrounded by quiet. The morning sun had risen now, filtering through the windows in soft golden bands that touched the hardwood floor and lit the edges of her shelves. Everything inside the room was still, the kind of stillness earned, not given, the kind that comes after long storms and longer silences. She looked around the space one last time. Her desk was clear, the walls bare, even the clock ticked more gently, as if aware that its work here was nearly finished. This had been more than just an office. It had been a proving ground, a shelter, a command center, a confessional, and in many ways, a witness. It had seen her battle ghosts. It had held her pain in long nights and welcomed her courage each morning. She owed it a proper goodbye. Evelyn reached for her coat and slung it over her arm, then picked up the box, the one with Riker's photo, her badge, her citation, and her story. She didn't clutch it. She just held it firmly, like something that belonged in her hands, but not her heart anymore. She walked to the door. Before turning off the light, she glanced once more at the small placard mounted by the doorframe. DX Legal Consultant. She let her fingers touch the metal for a second, tracing the letters not for ego, but for memory. Then she stepped out. The hallway was empty, save for one janitor buffing the floors. He paused and nodded at her, recognizing her but saying nothing. Sometimes the deepest respect comes in silence. She nodded back. Evelyn walked slowly, past the same stairwell where she'd once caught Riker watching her, past the courtroom where he shoved her in front of a dozen silent witnesses, past the corner where her hand had once pressed into the wall, trying not to shake. Each step now was different. Each hallway had been returned to her, not through vengeance, but through truth. She reached the building's front doors. Marcus was waiting. He didn't speak either. He just opened the door for her, letting in the morning breeze. She stepped outside. The street was alive with quiet motion, shop owners unlocking gates, buses sighing into stops, birds gossiping in the trees. Life ordinary and extraordinary. She turned back briefly, looking at the courthouse one last time. It no longer held her, and that, in itself, was the victory. Marcus cleared his throat, voice catching. "I guess this is it." She gave a half smile. "For this building, yes." He hesitated. "You sure you want to go? You could stay, teach, run the whole department if you wanted." Evelyn shook her head. "The work needs to keep moving, not settle." He blinked, as if trying to hold back emotion. "What should I tell people when they ask where you went?" She thought for a moment, then said, "Tell them I went back to the beginning, to the record." Marcus nodded. She extended her hand. He took it, but then pulled her into a brief, tight hug. When they parted, she turned and began walking down the steps. At the bottom, she paused. From her coat pocket, she pulled a small bronze key, the office key. She looked at it for a moment, then walked back to the security desk inside and placed it gently on the counter. The guard on duty looked up. "You don't need that anymore?" he asked. She smiled. "No, I've already opened every door I needed to." And with that, she turned and walked back out, her pace steady and unhurried. As she reached the sidewalk, her phone buzzed softly. It was a message from a courthouse volunteer in Michigan. A survivor just accessed the registry, found her abuser on it. She said, "Now I can breathe." Evelyn typed back just 2 words. "Tell her, remembering is power." She slipped the phone back into her pocket and looked up. The sky was wide and pale blue, the kind of color that only appears when the storm has fully passed. She walked forward, into the soft morning light. No one followed. But behind her, the system had changed. Not because she'd demanded it, but because she'd remembered and refused to let the world forget again.